In this episode, I'm talking about healthcare and connection. So, husbandry and veterinary procedures or interventions, and our relationship with our horses and how we communicate. Because these things can show up gaps in understanding, they can show up physical dysfunction or discomfort or pain, and they are also a real opportunity for us to improve our relationship with our horses. So let's have a look at how healthcare procedures can actually improve our horse-human relationship. Hi there, I'm Lily. Welcome to the Vital Horse podcast. I'm a veterinary surgeon passionate about what our animals' behaviour can alert us to. I focus on nurturing the innate nature of animals to address the deep roots of health, well-being and vitality. Our relationship with our horses is an inextricable part of this. I am guided by what they show me. Many people say, if only they could talk, but they can tell us so much and we can communicate back. This podcast is about you being able to help your horse fully by finding out what's going on, deciding how best to help, and then doing this ethically and effectively. In this way, we can investigate and treat behavioural signs and underlying health problems, pain, or dysfunction in our horses while actually improving our relationship with them. Let's find out how. Hi there, welcome to this episode on healthcare and connection. We can think of healthcare as the things that a professional, say a vet or a farrier or a barefoot trimmer perhaps, or a saddle fitter, or I could go on, that horse professionals come out to investigate or treat in your horse, and also day-to-day husbandry or regular husbandry procedures that you carry out with your horse at home. And there are phases to healthcare. So there's maybe when you think that there might be something going on that isn't quite right, then you have an investigation phase. And then you also have the treatment, management, recovery, rehabilitation. There are lots of different ways of phrasing that, depending on the approach that you are taking in helping them once we know what it is that we need to do. So, in both of these phases, I think that there's a lot of room for misunderstandings and miscommunications and misattunements. We're usually trying to help, so we don't mean to be doing that. And it can also be very worrying time when a horse isn't quite right, or especially if it's really urgent or an emergency. It's also a real opportunity for communication and connection and knowing your horse and maybe yourself as well a bit better. So, in the investigation phase, we might have observation and assessments of our horses in the first place, and that's probably what will lead to us calling a professional out. And then the investigation phase might also include some procedures, which are diagnostic procedures, which the horse might find maybe scary or uncomfortable, or they don't understand what it is that's required of them. Maybe they require restraint or containment. So, in the observation and assessment stage, you may have noticed sort of a difficult behaviour, something that maybe you would rather not that you would have happening. And maybe this also makes it difficult to investigate. But this is actually an opportunity because this is kind of your in to your investigation. So the horse is communicating that they can't do something or that they're worried about doing something. And really, what we need to do in this situation is to break that down into tiny chunks to identify what it is they're finding hard about that situation. And this is the approach that I take with needle shyness in horses, is that I first of all investigate the deep-rooted underlying causes. So it may be more of an emotional trauma although that is also held in their body. It may be a thought process that they are worried about what's coming next, or it may actually be really quite physical and that they have sensations of pain before we've even touched them with a hand or the needle has gone in. It might be that they have grumbling pain or actually quite severe pain in their body, and so needles are actually very painful for them. And so that's investigating the deep-rooted underlying causes. But in then the sort of two-pronged approach is first investigate those deep-rooted underlying causes, and then the second one is to teach a cooperative care procedure, which means that they can ask us to pause or they can opt in and opt out of the procedure. It's a very predictable sequence of events that happens, and I use positive reinforcement to teach that. So I usually use food. And it's chunked down into such tiny steps that you can identify which part of the process it really is that they're finding most difficult and then help them with that part. So this separation between physical, mental, and emotional is kind of false because they are all very fluid and impacting each other all of the time. But it can be useful to think of it in those terms. Is there perhaps a physical block, so either discomfort or perhaps dysfunction or just inability to do something that is getting in the way of them carrying out your request or joining you in an activity? Is it that they don't understand? So it's more of a mental, they actually don't understand the process, and that either makes them worried or they can't carry it out because they don't know what they're supposed to be doing next. Or is it emotional? Is there maybe fear involved? Is there panic involved? Is there maybe even rage coming up? So my attuned assessment approach is the part of this whole healthcare process where we make observations of our horses in all sorts of different contexts. And a lot of that I do just in the normal course of their daily activities. I do a lot of observing. So how are they standing, either to rest or to eat? Are they lying down? How much and how? How do they get up and down? What postures do they use, even to poo and to pee? Certainly to eat, to groom. Can they reach around and scratch on different parts of their body in both directions? And then how do they choose to move? How often, at what speeds, in what sorts of postures? And my setup here is very helpful for that because I have lots of different hay stations at different heights in at different aspects. I have a track system which allows for a lot of movement. They live in a herd, and so they show a lot of behaviours, and so I can watch for lots of different things: direction of chewing, facial expressions, behavioural responses. So that's part of really getting to know your horse as an individual and also in how they're expressing their normal behaviors and whether maybe something is missing that they would usually do, or maybe the way that they do something doesn't seem quite right and maybe suggests dysfunction or discomfort. So it might be that you notice that your horse has stopped lying down or is lying down a lot more often. It might be that they're only rolling on one side, or that they used to be able to roll all the way over and they can't anymore. It might be that they choose to eat at a particular height. You might notice the orientation of their limbs has changed when they're eating. So they gather their limbs really far underneath them or they spread them really far apart, try to stabilize themselves. More obvious things you would notice, a lameness, for example, but more subtle things you might notice, say, for example, that they usually only turn to one side in order to, perhaps they go from one hay net to another and they always curve their body more to one side than the other. And then you can start to build up a picture of what it is if you think something's not quite right. What context does it happen in? What timings does it happen with? What happens before and after? and what is the sort of flavor, what's the vibe of what they're doing. And that really helps when you're then discussing the investigation, the more sort of formal and in-depth investigation with a professional, and maybe which professional you need to call out when. So is it likely to be a saddle fit problem? Maybe do their feet hurt, or is their foot balance maybe changing? Their foot shape and alignment might be changing. Do we need to address that? Or is it perhaps something that you think that there's pain somewhere in their body and maybe it needs to be a vet or a body worker, for example? So that's the observation stage. And really, a large part of that is this question of what is normal. And it's important to ask the question, is this just common in horses, or is this actually normal for horses? Because I think that a lot of the time we can a little bit fall into a trap of, oh, well, lots of horses do this. I see this all the time. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's normal. There's quite a lot of normalized abnormal in domesticated animals, many different species. So it shouldn't be considered normal if it's just very common, but it's actually not very functional or healthful or helpful for their vitality and longevity. So an example of that is posture. So it's very, very common for domesticated horses to have what's called an abnormal compensatory posture. And that usually involves a combination of some changes in their hoof alignment. Changes in their limb alignment is one of the most noticeable factors in that. So they often have their limbs non-vertical and they're gathered more underneath, so more towards the center of their belly. And this can have all sorts of knock-on effects on lots of musculoskeletal structures. And it's also more of a sympathetic nervous system, so fight or flight system, nervousness, highly strung posture to be in. And you can often have horses that feel quite stressed a lot of the time, adopting that posture because it's a ready to flee or ready to fight posture, because it reflects their internal emotional state. So this is where physical, mental, and emotional are really fluid. But this abnormal compensatory posture is seen very often in domesticated horses because the control of their posture is, well, there are three main areas of the body that are really important for controlling posture, and we modify all of them through domesticating horses. And that is their teeth and their jaw, their upper neck muscles, so around the poll, and their feet. So there are lots of inputs that we change relative to what a free roaming horse population would experience. And then we also ask them to be athletic in situations that we would like to control. And it may be that the majority of their day doesn't really set them up for those athletic endeavors because their posture is strengthening certain structures, weakening others, putting too much load on some structures, and also affecting their emotional state. Some of the things that we modify to those three areas that are very important for governing their posture are we use headgear. So even if that's just a head collar or a halter, we tie them up. They have pullback injuries often when tied. We put bits in their mouths. We do or don't perform adequate dental care to allow for good jaw function and information from the sockets of their teeth. We have different terrains, or actually sometimes always the same terrain that a horse walks on, and so they don't develop much adaptability in their proprioception. We trim their feet, we apply boots, and we put shoes on, and all of those change the input that goes into their central nervous system to tell them what posture to actually be standing and moving in. And we also feed them at abnormal heights and using artificial means. Now, there's all sorts of helpful things that we can do in those regards. So we can use head collars and halters that are good for their function. We can fit their bits and their bridles to be better for their function. we can provide them lots of different terrains, and we can use trimming, booting, and shoeing practices that encourage good function. The fact of the matter is that we have modified their environment and their lifestyle through domestication, and there likely will be some suboptimal conditions for their posture. And so we are likely to have this output of an abnormal posture in a lot of cases. We can help it, we can bring it back to normal. But the whole conversation there was about the fact that this is very, very common to see, but it doesn't make it normal. And we may well need to change some things in order for the horse to be able to carry out some of the athletic requirements that we place on them. And it may also be that their emotional state is being affected by their habitual posture as well. The other thing to talk about normal and common versus normal is in observing horses in a lot of depth and breadth, we can figure out what is normal for that individual, or what is their baseline, and what is their current baseline, and perhaps should that be their baseline long term, or can we hope and expect and help them through some changes so that they reach perhaps a more functional and healthier and more enjoyable baseline. So, talking about procedures in healthcare, this can be in the investigation stage, so diagnostics, for example, and in the treatment, management, rehabilitation, recovery phase. And there are a lot of things that that we sort of need horses to engage in sometimes for their health and well-being. Now, there is, of course, the conversation to have about how much to put a horse through in terms of invasive procedures, or in terms of procedures and activities that are going to be very stressful for them. But at the same time, we need to make sure that we are safeguarding their welfare and that we don't opt out of important healthcare interventions. So if they are perhaps a very traumatized horse that finds any kind of human contact or interaction difficult, then certainly healthcare procedures are likely to be even more stressful for them. It's useful to prepare for these in advance, and also to go slowly enough so as not to completely overwhelm horses if they find these things very difficult. Some horses will find some of these procedures completely fine, and some of them very either scary, uncomfortable, or difficult to functionally carry out. And I'll just give some examples of some care behaviours that will probably be needed at some point in a domesticated horse's life. So, touching all over, that you might not think that that's a healthcare intervention as such, and it's not so much formally, but it's important to be able to examine, do a clinical examination by a professional, and just as an owner to be able to check the horse's body over, and also just in order to know that they're comfortable enough in their body to be touched. So touching all over, and that includes ears, it includes their groin, and for things like sheath or udder cleaning. If that is really uncomfortable for them, then that is something to actually investigate. And also inside their mouth. So of course not sticking your whole hand inside their mouth, but just being able to gently feel inside the corners of the lips and around the gums of the incisors. That should be comfortable for a horse. If it's uncomfortable, then there may well be something abnormal going on. Being able to open their mouth, so to pull the lips gently away from the incisors to be able to look at them, and to be able to open their jaw slightly, just with a finger in the corner of their mouth, for example, to take a bit or to take an oral syringe for worming or medication. Eye cleaning or application of eye drops. And then the next category is foot handling, and this can be very revealing. And actually, I'm going to be doing a webinar soon. I'm going to be offering a free webinar soon on this subject, because it can tell you a lot about them physically, mentally, and emotionally. So foot handling is actually quite involved for a horse. It involves giving us their means of escape, and so it does require a lot of trust. And it's not just lifting, it's also lifting and holding for a period of time in order to be able to get whatever it is done that you need to get done, whether that's picking their feet out, maybe applying an antimicrobial spray, which is another thing. The use of spray can sometimes be quite scary for horses, or the sensation can be uncomfortable, and that's useful information as well. Maybe applying antimicrobial hoof clay, and then, of course, applying things to the foot. So, whether that's a boot or a shoe, they may need to place their foot on a block, for example, to have x rays taken. They may need to place their foot on a block with just their toe on the block. They have to pull their leg forwards often for certain parts of the trim. They have to be able to bring their leg backwards far enough to be able to see all parts of the hoof and for certain parts of a trim or shoeing applications, for example. They will probably have to place their feet on a hoof stand, forwards and underneath them or backwards. We may need to tub their feet, maybe in a bucket or a boot if they have an infection, for example. We may need to apply a bandage or some kind of more clumpy boot or poultice, and we may need to hose their feet and legs. So that is a lot that's involved in foot and leg handling, and it can be very revealing which parts of this horses feel okay about, feel truly okay about, and which parts they don't, or which parts they absolutely cannot do. So, for example, it gives us some clues as to comfort of various structures. So they may not want to lift one particular limb if they don't really want to weight another one or the other three. Maybe if they're quite weak in their core and they find it difficult to balance and hold one limb up, that may also lead to them slamming their foot back down before we're finished with doing a particular task. They may not be able to pull a leg forwards because of restrictions or discomforts higher up or actually in the limb itself. So this is where you can actually start to dissect and figure out what it is that's going on for them, and therefore have a bit more of an idea of targeting your investigations. And this is all part of helping them with the procedures, because if we can't be targeted, they may have to go through more investigations and procedures, some which are perhaps going towards dead ends, if we're not really sure exactly what it is, the signs that they're showing us, and what that might mean. So, a few more things that may become essential care behaviours: applying fly masks on and off, rugs perhaps, and mentioned sprays, so maybe antimicrobial or fly sprays. That can be changed if they can't cope with a spray. We can apply it in a different way. But some horses are very worried by anything with a scent even. So it doesn't matter if we're spraying it or maybe sponging it. They may find that difficult. And interesting to consider which senses seem to be more dominant for them or seem to really worry them, because some horses, that can also tell us about the state of their body, mind, and emotions. If they are particularly sensitive to visual stimuli, maybe scent or maybe sounds, and that can, or not actually, and that can give us some clues as to how they sense the world, any deficits in those, or hypervigilance in those senses. Bandage applications, so we may have to bandage limbs, parts of their head, their neck perhaps, maybe their tail, being able to touch those areas and apply something to them. The use of clippers, we may have to do that to clip around a wound. We may have to do it if they have a coat change abnormality. For example, if a horse has Cushing's or PPID, pituitary pars intermedia dysfunction, and they aren't shedding their winter coat and they get too sweaty, we may have to clip them. We may have to clip them for certain skin conditions or parasite infestations and to apply medications. And of course, if they have a wound that needs stitching. Needles. We may need to use needles intravenously. We may need to draw blood. We may need to give medications. For example, pain relief. We may need to give sedation for needed procedures like dental work, if they have a wound that we need to stitch. And we may need to give them medication if they are having a colic episode or something like that. And intramuscular for things like vaccines and other medications. Now, in my needle shyness online course, I do have an entire module on the alternatives to certain injectable preparations and maybe limiting our needle use if horses are very traumatized and find needles excruciatingly painful. But in order to be safest, any horse might need an emergency or urgent needle use at some point to safeguard their health and welfare. And so addressing the question of why a horse finds needles very difficult is definitely a helpful thing to do. And other things that may become important for their health and welfare are being able to load and travel to a vet hospital, for example, and also being able to be confined on box rest. Now, I actually think that box rest is massively overused because movement is usually more helpful for most conditions for horses, and their emotional state is very important for their healing. But there are some things where confinement on box rest is really needed. For example, they have an unstable fracture, or most fractures will need confinement on box rest, and some other conditions will need confinement. And if a horse is incredibly stressed being confined in a stable, you could hope that it never happens, but you could also address it in preparation for in case that were to ever happen. And there isn't necessarily actually a right answer about that because it might never happen. And the preparation for that could be very stressful for the horse, depending on how you go about it. So, how we do things as well as what we do is very important. So, preparing for all of these things in advance is a good idea. And of course, how we do it is important. The prerequisites to a lot of these activities can show us a lot about our relationship and our communication with our horses and what they do and don't understand. So, for example, before you do any of these activities, you will probably need to approach your horse and put a halter on, unless you do everything at liberty, which is another conversation. If your horse is not really buying into even that process, then that is where we should start with these things. Then, with these activities, we are likely to need to stand near, look at, and touch a particular area of their body, and then probably handle it and manipulate it, for example, with the foot handling. So, if your horse isn't really okay with you even standing in that location, then that's the place that we start. So, you can start to see how preparing for these sorts of procedures can actually give you a lot of information about what your horse understands, maybe bad experiences that they've had in the past, maybe areas of their body that they are concerned about, that they're guarding a bit from maybe being touched. And therefore, where we can start to help them with those things that will be actually more global than just helping that one procedure. There are questions about how to address these things when a horse has actually a trauma response, and they maybe even have flashbacks, they maybe have painful sensations before the actual activity has happened. For example, I have seen horses, I do believe that with some very needle shy horses, they can feel an excruciating pain before we've even started, because maybe the sight of the needle, maybe the sight of a vet with a stethoscope around their neck, maybe the sight of the vet's van could bring back trauma flashbacks. So that is a possibility. I think that happens in some horses. And that requires quite an intricate approach to helping them to release that trauma. And sometimes it requires as well, or it usually often does require really limiting our actual needle use because they have a very small capacity for coping with that. So only really using it when we have done an all-round assessment. Does this needle use need to happen now? Can it maybe be delayed? In some cases, of course, it does need to happen now for their health and well-being. Now, procedures can also highlight that a horse is painful. Maybe that they have a grumbling underlying pain and that they can have a phenomenon called wind-up pain or central sensitization, where they've they've had pain for a while, and so their nervous system is actually heightened. There are superhighways that have been created in their nervous system that make maybe stimuli that would normally only be very mildly painful, it makes them more extremely painful. Or even sometimes it can make stimuli that wouldn't normally be painful. So perhaps just touching with a hand could actually make that actually painful for the horse. So if it's proving difficult to even investigate because even the diagnostics or examining them is difficult, then that's obviously there are some difficulties with that, but it's also an opportunity because they are actually telling you that they are painful, that this is part of the whole puzzle picture. Another area that it can bring up is, and this is all in the sort of prerequisites and their relationship and communication and their understanding, is how they feel about restraint or being contained. Because a lot of the time with needle shyness, actually, it can be the restraint rather than the actual needle that they either have a trauma response surrounding or that they are actually really worried about. So perhaps they've been very strongly physically restrained in the past. They may have had a pullback injury when tied, or a pullback injury with somebody holding onto a rope, for example. Even worse if they have a bridle on, potentially. Or they may even find just containment difficult. So, being in a smaller space, for example, sometimes injections or blood draws are attempted inside a stable if the horse is trying to use flight to avoid a needle. And that can maybe sometimes actually heighten their worry because they have a worry about being contained in a small space. So, you can use those things to identify which things do they find difficult, do they find, worrying, are they scared of, or that they don't understand, or that cause pain or dysfunction or discomfort. Now, I will say that preparing for these things, even if we chunk it down into very, very small pieces and small steps, it can actually still introduce a fair amount of stress. So I did go through a stage where I was teaching a lot of teaching and learning from the horses that I was teaching, a lot of cooperative care behaviours. And I actually thought, wow, I really need to break this up because I'm trying to improve this needle shyness. And so I'm doing a lot of sessions and I was using positive reinforcement with food and really trying to chunk things down very small and make the sessions enjoyable and listen to the feedback that the horse was giving me on how invested they still were, how engaged they still were in the session and actually enjoying it. And at the same time, needed to do some other things that were not even approaching a situation that they felt that they found uncomfortable. So we do need a balance because there are a lot of things in that list of essential care behaviours that I mentioned earlier on, which we could be preparing for all the time, but we also could just be doing enjoyable things with our horses, like going for a foraging walk or ride, or doing something that they enjoy, scratches and grooming and all sorts of things, just hanging out, spending quality time with them. So, in summary, I think that there is a really strong link between when we are trying to investigate whether there's something health related or pain related going on with our horses, and if we are experiencing behavioural obstacles, as it were, and also our relationship and communication with our horses. So we can really pay attention to what their mind, body, and emotions are telling you. And therefore, this process can actually be an opportunity for greater connection, as opposed to where our relationship breaks down because we're trying to impose procedures on horses that are uncomfortable and that are scary. Now, we can't be perfect because sometimes situations will happen where there is actually, something happens where it's an emergency or an urgent situation, and we can't take things as slowly as we would like to, and we maybe can't pay attention, or we can pay attention, but we can't actually fully honour our horse saying, I really don't want to participate in this, because it would be dangerous if we didn't help them in that scenario. So, we have to stitch a wound or we have to give a medication for a colic episode. If that is the case, there may be some relationship repair that is then needed. But in general, I think that actually observing our horses in order to see what they need from their lifestyle to prevent problems, observing them to figure out what is the combination of signs that they are showing in order for us to have a more targeted and successful diagnostic process to figure out what's going on with them, and then recovering from that or managing it, are then there's something, as opposed to a sort of inconvenient side to what you're trying to do with your horse. They can actually be all part of your relationship with them. And they become amazingly communicative when they realize that you are noticing these things, you're acknowledging them, and you're honoring them. So you pause when they need pauses, you break things down into smaller steps when they need that. You avoid asking them for movements that they currently can't do because they are too weak or they're uncomfortable, and you work on things in a different way in order to help them with that. And then when you ask them again and they discover that they can do a little bit more, it builds a lot of confidence. And they come to actually see you as a safe place, a fun place, and someone that they can actually tell, I can't do this right now. This is uncomfortable for me. I'm feeling worried, and that you can help to change the situation for them to help them through it. So, if you do have a needle shy horse, or actually a horse who finds other certain healthcare procedures or interventions very difficult, my needle shyness course live running is coming up starting next on the 1st of July. And this is a 12-week coached course. It's an online course. You have lifetime access to the course materials, which is over 30 webinars and videos on looking into the deep-rooted causes in your individual horse and helping those, and then going through a cooperative care process of helping them to feel better about needles. And it also includes a lot of live support from me during this 12-week period. So we have 4 live Zoom Q&A calls. You can book up to 3 one-to-one coaching calls with me. So either to delve into the deep-rooted causes, and sometimes we actually find, a diagnosis or a diagnostic hook in order to be able to do some diagnostics to find out what's going on, because we actually find that there is pain somewhere in their body, and that is what the needle shyness is all about. So you can either use the coaching calls for delving into that, or for coaching through the cooperative care training process, or a combination of the two. You can submit videos for feedback and guidance on investigating and the training process. And there are worksheets to take with you to help you to put the concepts into practice, and a Facebook discussion group where you can share your photos and videos and have questions answered. So to sign up for that, and best to do that before the 1st of July, all of the course materials start being released then. Go to nurturingnatureequine.co.uk/needles. And if it's not needles specifically, but it's another healthcare procedure, this course can still help you with that, because of all of the foundational concepts in the prerequisites for preparing for this, gaps in communication and improving your relationship, and then a cooperative care approach to a procedure. So you could even use it for applying fly spray, for example, or foot handling, and we can have those conversations in the live Q&As. So I hope to see you there. For a more in-depth coverage of the needle shyness topic, I also offer a free webinar on the subject. So that's available at nurturingnatureequine.co.uk/needles-webinar, or you can also find it on a previous podcast episode on needle shyness, and that is podcast episode number 3 on needle shyness, and that's the webinar in podcast form. I will see you in the next episode. Thanks for listening to the Vital Horse podcast, where you can find discussions focused on helping horses in ways that combine scientific principles and evidence with compassion and understanding. Do subscribe if this content has rung true for you. To work with me in a way that honours both head and heart, check out my online and in-person offerings at www.nurturingnatureequine.co.uk. If you are facing problems or are trying to answer questions with your horse, remember that physical, mental and emotional well-being are inextricably interconnected, that there is a wisdom to nature and to the body that we can assist, and that cultivating meaningful relationships with our animal companions holds an important key to the well-being of all of us. Deep awareness and a compassionate process will enable us to find sustainable, ethical solutions. See you for the next episode and look forward to working with you too.